Well, thank you, Sean, and thank you for organizing this series of talks. I'm really looking forward to talking to folks in South Africa. I love South Africa. I think, visited there for business purposes, but visited there, I think, about 5 times now. So that's been a real pleasure for me over the years. And I'll probably tell a little bit about that as I go on tonight. I organized this kind of chronologically along my journey to study forgiveness, and also as it turned out along the way to reach personal forgiveness of other people and of myself. So I'll be talking about my personal experiences as well as the research as we go through this. So uh, what I have some objectives for the talk, and by the end I hope that you'll be able to identify two different types of forgiveness, which we call decisional forgiveness and emotional forgiveness, and be able to tell those apart and tell why they are different from reconciliation. Another thing that I want to introduce you to is a program that we have studied all over the world called Reach Forgiveness. And to just kind of quickly go through those steps to reach forgiveness, and to let you know that those materials are free and available easily on my website, which Sean will post. Uh, and then the last objective that I have for this talk tonight is to briefly tell you about the benefits of forgiving. I say brief because this whole series is really aimed at bringing in different speakers who are experts on different ones of those benefits. So I'm just going to kind of mention them and refer to the speaker who is going to talk about those later in the week. So those are my objectives, and I'm looking forward to getting to sharing these things with you. So in general, there are four major types of forgiveness, and two of those are experienced more uh, from the point of view of feeling that we've done something wrong. And two of those are experienced more from the point of view that somebody has wronged us. So the two that we experience mostly as wrongdoers are divine forgiveness, which is receiving forgiveness from God or from nature or the cosmos or humanity, and also self-forgiveness. We struggle more with self-condemnation than we actually struggle with forgiving ourselves. The two that we experience as being wronged are person-to-person forgiveness, where we're just trying to forgive someone who's harmed us or offended us, and then social or societal forgiveness. So that's kind of the overview of the types of forgiveness. I'm going to talk mostly about person-to-person forgiveness, but touch on self-forgiveness and perhaps just briefly on social and societal forgiveness. So forgiveness can be a real turning point in people's lives. And it can be a sudden turning point that's pretty dramatic, or one that's not so dramatic but ends up having dramatic consequences. So you can see this if you picture someone in Cape Town looking north, and they could end up in lots of different places. They could end up in Namibia, or over to the east to Port Elizabeth, Durban, or Johannesburg. When the journey starts, there isn't much difference in the direction that they're heading, but you can see that the destination of where they get to in the end is going to be quite different if it's Durban, for example, or Johannesburg. So forgiveness can be like that. It can be a dramatic turning point where you see differences right away, or it can be a more subtle change. But if you follow that path of continuing to forgive, it can have very radical consequences for you down the road. So I call forgiveness the hard virtue because it is a virtue that is experienced inside our skin, and that that need we have to forgive or to deal with injustices um, comes to us within social situations. And yet the experience that I have, even if it's social or societal forgiveness, is something that happens inside me. It happens in a social context. So the social context is very important. It's vital, as we'll see. But nevertheless, the experience of forgiveness happens internally. Now, personally, I started looking at forgiveness, of course, from a personal standpoint, as a Christian. I started looking at it back in the 1970s, but professionally, my first experience with it was really in a clinical setting where I was supervising a doctoral student who was counseling a couple. His name was Don Dancer, and the couple wasn't getting any better, and I said to Don, I said, Don, so what's wrong with this couple? Why are they not getting any better? And Don said, well, I don't know. We've taught them all about your hope-focused couple approach, but they just kind of hate each other, and they've got all these grudges. And I said, well, Don, then we need to make up some kind of little way to help them forgive each other. And I remember Don's eyes getting real big and him saying, can we do that in a state university? And I said, sure, we can do that in a state university. We won't tell anybody. I'm the supervisor. We'll just do this. But yeah, we'll do this. And so we made up a a little intervention that was a decision-based intervention in which we just tried to help people come to a decision to act differently toward their partner. And that decision-based model, I worked with a colleague, Fred de Blasio, and taught him and his agency that little decision-based model. And then we went ahead and began to study that model scientifically. But it became clear early on that there's more to forgiving than just making a decision to treat the person differently. There's this, I can make a decision to forgive a person, still feel really emotionally upset every time I think about the person. And so there must be a second type of forgiveness, which is a more emotional type of forgiveness. And we found that if people could empathize with the person who had hurt them, that helped them change their emotions toward the person. So we began to look at this back in the early 90s, and by 1995, I had submitted a grant to study forgiveness in early married couples. That grant took about 20 years to complete, all the data collection, analysis, and publication on it. But we had received that, well, not received it, but we had the grant under consideration in 95. And then in New Year's Eve night in 1996, a big disruption happened in my life, and that was in a home invasion. My mother was murdered in a very brutal way by a young man, apparently, who was thinking that no one was home because it was New Year's Eve, and he saw a darkened house and no car in the driveway because my mother did not drive. And so he broke into the house, and apparently she eventually woke up and confronted him, and he had a crowbar that he had used to break the window to get into the house, and he bludgeoned her with the crowbar and until she died. So this was very difficult to deal with, although I felt like God had really helped me deal with it, and I was able to forgive quite quickly. In about one night, I came to a decision and really an emotional change about that man or young man who murdered my mom. So I know forgiveness is very difficult, and it sounds like, oh wow, I forgave somebody in a one night who murdered my mom. I am not some kind of uber forgiver. Let me tell you, I had a professor once who gave me a B, and it took 10 years and a religious experience in order to forgive that guy. But this was just a special time where I happened to be able to forgive by working through the steps in that reach forgiveness model of recalling the hurt and empathizing with the young man out there in the cold, waiting to in this hemisphere it was cold on January the 1st, and then giving him an altruistic gift of forgiveness that he did not deserve, and committing to it, and then being able to hold on to that. Well, right after that, in late 95, I was invited to South Africa to speak to 3 Christian counseling conferences in Cape Town, Durban, and Pretoria. And the guy who organized this was Mervyn van der Spey, who was president of the Christian Counselors of South Africa at that time. And I told Mervyn, I said, Mervyn, I'm an academician. Besides being a clinical psychologist, I'd really like to speak to universities if I can. Next thing I hear, it's, about March of 96, and the South African government contacted me and said, listen, we'd like to appoint you as a visiting scholar while you're here, and we'll pay your way over, and all you have to do is speak to a bunch of universities while you're in South Africa. So, all right, Mervyn worked his magic there and got me into doing the things that I wanted to do, which was to speak to a bunch of counselors and speak to just folks, and then also to academic places. So I spent 23 days in South Africa in 1996. The first Truth and Reconciliation Commission human rights hearings had just ended, and they had not really started the amnesty hearings yet. So I had a chance to do a lot of speaking in South Africa. One of my favorite moments was I was at Durban Westville University, and a bomb threat goes off, and sirens are going off and police are running around, and the people who were in the academic seminar are like, oh, we have these all the time, no problem, just press on. Well, I wasn't quite used to that, but as it turned out, we did not blow up, so that was good. I also had the chance to give some sermons at churches and be interviewed on radio and also on television. And that television interview turned out to be very, I think, very fortuitous, because the guy who interviewed me asked me if I had a chance to speak to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Johannesburg. And I said I had not, that they were between the meetings. And he said, well, listen, I know Pete Meyering on the commission. And he says, you call him up and tell him that I said that the commission has to hear you speak. And so I'm like, yeah, well, that sounds cheeky. Okay. But Mervyn called up, and it turned out that he just happened, Pete Myring just happened to be in town, one day. He had been traveling and happens to be in town on the Friday before I left. And as it turned out, that was the only day I did not have anything scheduled in the whole 23 days that I was down in South Africa. That Sunday, we didn't know if the TRC had room in their schedule to talk to me, but that Sunday I preached at a church in Randburg near Johannesburg, and I had a real conversation with God during that talk, and I ended up telling a little story about a meeting I'd gone to, and even though I felt very pressed for time, and I felt like I was kind of, arguing with God, but in the end, I told the story anyway. So that Thursday night after that, I received a message from Pete Myring saying that I could address the TRC in Johannesburg, that branch, on the next day, Friday, which was the same day I was going to leave for the USA that afternoon. So I also received a message that night from Justice Clausen of the South African Supreme Court, urging me to tell the Truth and Reconciliation Commission a prophecy that he had heard back in the 1970s. Now I was like, no, I don't think I'm going to do this. I don't think the Truth and Reconciliation Commission is going to be really open to a Christian prophecy that was given 20 years before. But it turned out I met with the TRC the next day and told them the science and the clinical aspects. And then, I had kind of fought off the idea that I should tell them this prophecy. I'd been arguing with God the entire time of meeting. But at the end, I did not tell the prophecy. And as we gathered up our things to leave, somebody said, I can't help but think that someone in this room was supposed to say something today and they did not say it. And I was like, oh my gosh, really? And so I confessed that I, had been contacted by Justice Clausen, and I read this prophecy that had been published in a book of proceedings. And basically, the prophecy, which given in the 1970s, said, I saw a map of Africa, and a spotlight fell on the southern tip of Africa. And there was great bloodshed and carnage in that area. But out of this bloodshed, there arose a black man and a white man, and they extended their arms and they were reconciled. And I said, well, there's the prophecy. I'm just the messenger, blame Justice Clausen. Well, anyway, we go outside to have a little tea before I take off, and I asked the person who was head of it. It was not Archbishop Tutu, who happened to be in the U.S. at that point, receiving treatment for his cancer that he had at that point. But I asked the leader of the Johannesburg branch if he had any literature on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He goes, "Hey, we have got literature, let me tell you." And he brings out this, big armful of stuff. I looked down at the logo, and I couldn't help but just see that it was a black man and a white man with their arms extended to each other, and underneath it said Truth and Reconciliation. And I said, that prophecy given in 1970s was fulfilled by you, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So by the trip back to the United States, I had developed a kind of a new mission statement. I'd been thrown up in the air really with my mother's murder, and I had always been studying couple relationships up until that time as my major mission. But I came up with a new mission statement, which was to do all I can to promote forgiveness in every willing heart, home, and homeland. And that's the mission statement that I have continued with since that time. So I got a lot out of my experience that first trip to South Africa. I heard many inspiring stories and I got a great sense of the way that South Africa was coping with the post-apartheid situation. I also got a sense of excitement from the university students that I had spoken to, and the faculty were beginning to study forgiveness and reconciliation. And I got a sense of the power within the church and other non-religious communities to bring about forgiveness. So what did I share with the folks there? I did share my model to reach forgiveness. And this is a model that now has been tested in over 30 randomized controlled trials worldwide. It basically has 5 steps, which are easy to say and can be said quickly, but it turns out it's crucial to spend time thinking about and working with each step. So the first is recall the hurt. We have to recall the hurt if we're going to deal with it. Empathize with the person who hurt us. Or if we can't empathize, if we just can't get in their shoes, then sympathy or feeling compassion or love for that person can be the emotional replacement of the negative, unforgiving emotions. Give an altruistic gift that the person does not deserve, but it is a free altruistic gift, no strings attached. And then C, commit to the emotional experience of forgiveness that one has experienced, so that H, we hold on to that forgiveness whenever doubts arise. So in 1996, the evidence was fairly sketchy. There had been some support for a decision to forgive, a couple of studies on that, and some support for the Reach Forgiveness model, about 2 or 3 studies on that. But since then, the huge amount of support for that model. In addition, there was some evidence about the benefits of forgiving to people. So all of those types of evidence have been magnified many times in the 25 years since that point. So since 1996, that Reach Forgiveness model has been developed in groups. It's been taught in communities. There is a do-it-yourself workbook that people can fill out on their own time. It's been done in a web-based treatment and investigated in 30 randomized controlled trials. In 2014, we did a meta-analysis. This is an analysis of a whole bunch of studies. And that analysis actually found quite a number of things about the reach forgiveness model and other models to promote forgiveness. It found, for example, that there were two models that were the most heavily used, and those were Robert Enright's model and the reach forgiveness model. They were used about equally. Also, we found that when people forgive, their anxiety goes down, even though anxiety is not really covered in the reach forgiveness model. The depression that they might have goes down. Hope goes up. So there are these wonderful side benefits of forgiving that help people's mental health and well-being. So I said that there were some benefits of forgiveness, and other people would address these in detail. Let me just point out that on June 3rd, this Thursday, I will talk about forgiveness in couple relationships. And it turns out, decisional forgiveness is going to be really vital to relationships between partners, because they can treat each other better. They can see that the other person is trying to treat them better, and so that really helps the relationship. On Friday, June the 4th, Melissa Washington Norty, who is attending today, I saw her log into the room, and I will talk about recent research that we have done in religion and forgiveness. Mental health is going to be covered on Wednesday by John Webb of Texas Tech University in the United States. And he will, I'm sure, talk about how we ruminate less if we forgive, because we get a little closure on things. And rumination is like the universal bad boy of mental health. So it's related to obsessive compulsive disorders, to anxiety disorders, depression, to anger disorders, to psychosomatic disorders, and PTSD, lots of other things. So finally, physical health is going to be covered tomorrow night by Lauren Toussaint. This is a book that Lauren was the first co-editor on, Forgiveness and Health, and so I'm sure he will cover what happens with physical health. A lot of it boils down to what is called allostatic load, and allostatic load is kind of the stresses that build up on us. So higher amounts of stresses for longer periods of time change the cortisol in our body, and that cortisol will hurt every system in your body. So forgiveness reduces cortisol. And there are also indirect benefits of health that come about by better spiritual life and mental health and relationships. So in 1997 and 98, a game changer happened, and that was the John Templeton Foundation decided to fund $2 million worth of forgiveness. We didn't know that there were only 2 or 3 teams that were studying forgiveness at this point. We figured we'd get about 10 proposals. Turns out we got 250 letters of intent. We invited 136 to submit full proposals, and 34 of them followed through. In the end, a blue ribbon panel recommended funding 20 of those proposals, and we asked for an additional $1 million for a total of $3 million, and the John Templeton Foundation agreed to that. But the proposals were so good, the Templeton Foundation established a nonprofit corporation to raise additional money to fund other research into forgiveness, and created this nonprofit called A Campaign for Forgiveness Research. Archbishop Tutu was one of the two members that were the most active on the advisory board, and ex-President Jimmy Carter also lent his public support to that. In the end, that campaign raised $6.4 million additionally to fund additional research in forgiveness and also to put on some international conferences. So this is a lot of money thrown at understanding forgiveness scientifically for the most part, and then disseminating that those findings. John Templeton Foundation deeded another $3 million to make some documentary movies that ended up winning awards to disseminate the research on that. So what's happened since 98? Well, you know, I have continued to do a lot of studies and write books on research, but we have tried also to kind of change and not just look at every willing heart and home, but also look at promoting forgiveness throughout different people's homelands. And that meant getting into studying about social and societal forgiveness and the way that injustices happen in society and how those are dealt with. So justice is a social and societal happening, but individuals perceive if something is fair or not. So there's stuff that goes on in our mind about what we call the injustice gap, the sense of injustice, and there's also things that are going on in society. So justice is not opposed to forgiveness. Forgiveness happens inside our skin. So the man who murdered my mother, I could forgive him, but even if he were caught, he still would have to face the justice system. So my forgiveness is not opposed to the injustice, to the justice system. They happen in different, on different playing fields, if you will. And so this is true also throughout societies, on divided societies, divided politics, societies where atrocities or mass killings or you know, wars have happened. People will individually experience forgiveness, but things are still happening out in society, and those have to be dealt with in public in a societal situation. And that's difficult because those violations of justice are complex, and often justice interacts with other, one type of justice interacts with another. So there are different types of justice, such as procedural justice, that everybody follows the same procedures, or rehabilitative justice, where people, you know, are, let's say, convicted of a crime and sentenced to a rehabilitation. Well, that has turned out not to work very well. And so mostly we think of punishing criminals in a retributive justice model, where it's just two things that are not commensurable with each other. They did a crime and they have to have this kind of punishment. But there's also distributive justice, which is also called a lot today, is called social justice. That is, we want to be, you know, aware that things don't get distributed equally within society, and you know, we want to make those as fair as we can possibly make them. In civil and criminal cases, there's also restorative justice, in which we try to restore individuals to the community, usually because they've met with people in the community and they make amends in some way and apologize. And then in societies that have been at war with each other, such as, say, Colombia, that's been in a 60-year civil war, there is transitional justice. And this is like, you know, some amnesty that's happening, and, you know, but it's not total amnesty. The South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission was about transitional justice because it had rules that, well, you could get amnesty, but you had to be totally forthcoming with all crimes, and they had to be politically motivated, not personally motivated. This is a kind of a transitional justice. So what happens is that people individually establish what I call an injustice gap. And that's the difference between the way that I see things and the way that I would like to see things. If it's a big gap, it's hard to deal with. If it's a small gap, it's easier to deal with. So we don't just have forgiveness as a way of dealing with injustices, but there are many options for dealing with injustices. We could, for example, get revenge, not recommended because it triggers revenge in the person we got revenge against, but we could more positively see justice done, and that would reduce the injustice gap. We could see a person get the natural consequences of their harm doing. We could turn it over to God and just, have God, enact divine justice. We could just give it up to God, to relinquish it to God. We could forbear, which is something that's popular in collectivistic societies. Forbearance is just, I'm not going to respond negatively. We could tolerate differences. Well, that's not quite as positive as forbearance. Or we could accept that, stuff happens in life, bad stuff happens. I'm just going to accept that and move on. And that's much more positive than tolerance. The last way that we can deal with that injustice gap is we could forgive. And that means make a decision to forgive and perhaps experience emotional forgiveness. So decisional forgiveness is an intention statement where I say, I am going to not get revenge on this person, and I'm going to treat this person as a valued and valuable person. So this is a decision about how I'm going to act in the future toward this person. I could have sincere a decision to forgive and yet still feel emotionally upset every time I think about it. I could experience emotional unforgiveness, which is negative emotions like resentment, bitterness, hostility, hatred, anger, and fear. And that suggests there's got to be another type of forgiveness called emotional forgiveness, which is the emotional replacement of these negative, unforgiving emotions by positive, other-oriented emotions. So those positive, other-oriented emotions are emotions like empathy or sympathy or compassion or altruistic love or romantic love even. And that's helped along if we feel grateful for having been forgiven by someone in the past, or many people perhaps, having humility and recognizing that I too do things that are wrong, and then having hope about a positive future. Now, one other closely related but different idea is reconciliation. Reconciliation is restoring trust in a relationship where trust has been violated. Decisional forgiveness and emotional forgiveness both happen inside my skin, but reconciliation has to be in a relationship, and that therefore it depends on both people. So we can't grant reconciliation to someone. It has to be earned because both people are trying to be trustworthy. So decisional forgiveness and emotional forgiveness are not reconciliation, and also we should not confuse saying I forgive you as being forgiveness. because I could lie and say, well, I forgive you, so that you turn your back on me and let your guard down, and I stab you in the back. So what I say is in the social realm, and emotional and decisional forgiveness happen inside my skin. Now, what I want to do is I want to give some time for questions. So you might be thinking about questions, but I want to just talk for a brief moment about my brother's suicide in 2005. It turns out my brother was the one who found the body of my mom, and he never could get those pictures out of his mind. He told me about this 10 years, almost 10 years after her murder. We were having dinner together, and he's saying, I have these flashbacks of this vivid scene of walking in and seeing my mom, our mom's body. And as I listened to him, being a clinical psychologist, I said, Mike, it sounds like that you have a post-traumatic stress problem. I would recommend that you get some counseling for this. And Mike looks at me right in the eye and says, I'm not going to any shrink. This is what he says to his shrink brother, which tells you a little bit about our relationship growing up, probably. And so I tried again. I said, well, Mike, if you haven't gotten over this in 10 years, if you don't do something different, then you're probably not going to get over it in another few years. And he pointed his finger at me, and he was really emotional. His lip was trembling, and he says, I'm not going to any blankety blank shrink, and I don't want to hear any more about it. Now, I understand, as a clinical psychologist, I understand about resistance and, how to deal with resistance. You just kind of let it go by you and lower the emotional temperature and come back at it a different way. Did I do any of that with my brother? Not a chance. It was just like two hormone crazed adolescents going at it again. And my answer to him was, well, whatever then. And, so I didn't bring it up again. And then within 3 months, he committed suicide. And I felt very, very guilty about not behaving in ways that I knew would be helpful, because I just got hooked into this way of being an adolescent. Well, I figured out a kind of a way clinically to help people deal with self-forgiveness. I figured it out basically on myself, and then we tested it out in randomized controlled trials. Basically, it's a little more complicated than forgiving other people. So, so we don't start by jumping into the decision to forgive and reach emotional self-forgiveness. We really kind of experience this as, I've done wrong, so I have to go to God or humanity or nature, so whatever is the highest sacred authority in my life. I go to God for divine forgiveness and moral repair. And then secondly, I've done things wrong that have consequences in real life. And so I have to seek to make repair of the relationship. And I've probably injured myself psychologically. And so I need to reduce the rumination. I need to, work on my internal condemnation of myself. Then I'm okay to seek emotional self-forgiveness. So we have created do-it-yourself workbooks for this, and we've done studies on it, and we find that it works very well. It works also for something that's called moral injury today, where people witness themselves, other people, or see themselves doing things that they're not proud of, and really feel like they've done a moral injury to themselves. So let me just end by saying that forgiveness can change entire communities. I believe we've We've tried to change communities in about 6 or 7 different universities, in religious organizations, and in workplaces. This is one study that we did. And that there are many free resources available on my website, and I'll just leave that up there. I'm going to close by just telling a little story about a guy that I met. I was on television at one point. I was kind of an expert, and he was telling his personal story, but his name is Chris Carrier. And Chris Carrier was abducted when he was 10 years old. He was, this guy drives by in a pickup truck and says, "Your dad sent me to pick you up to take to a birthday party. He's giving up a surprise birthday party for your best friend. And, you know, I'll take you there." And so Chris gets in the truck, and this guy drives him out into the swamp in Florida, and ends up taking him out of the car and stabbing him with an ice pack numerous times in the body. And Chris said he was standing there, or laying there on the floor with this guy sitting on him, stabbing him, and he was crying, and he was looking at this guy going, "Why are you doing this? Why are you doing this?" And the guy suddenly says, "Yeah, you're right, and I need to take you home." And he takes Chris out to the truck, and when Chris steps up on the running board, the guy puts a gun against his head and shoots him. It goes into the temple and out his eye. Well, obviously, since I met Chris Carrier, it didn't kill him. It did take his eye out. But Chris says he woke up in the swamp and he had a headache, and made his way back to civilization. About over 10 years later, the police came to Chris and said, "You know, we've always thought we knew who did this to you, but we didn't have any evidence. And he's dying, and he needs to be confronted and not go out of this world without being confronted." So this deputy took Chris out into this, you know, to a mobile home, and Chris immediately recognized the guy who had abducted him. But he went over to the guy and he said, who's taking care of you? And the guy goes, "Well, I'm taking care of myself." Well, it was clear he was not taking care of himself. He couldn't get out of bed. And so Chris ended up not only forgiving this older man, but caring for him for the last 2 weeks of his life. This is forgiveness. This is really what forgiveness is all about. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Wow, I'm still busy processing everything that happened there and that you spoke about. I'm going to ask if we can maybe just stop the share screen at this stage and take some questions and answers during the Q&A time, and then we can maybe put up that, resources slide towards the end of the evening. Just give me a moment. I would just like to enlarge this. So Everett, thank you. You've touched on so many things. I've had people sending me questions privately just to post on the chat, and I'd like to moderate that if that's okay with you. Is that fine?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so one of the questions is, can you elaborate on the willingness to forgive versus offering forgiveness or reconciliation when the person has done wrong to you is unrepentant? For example, when the other person doesn't think they've wronged you, but they did hurt you. What is your take on that?
Well, I personally think that in principle, everything is forgivable. So in principle, no matter how big the hurt, it is, you have an injustice gap. And in principle, we can fill that injustice gap by seeing justice done, by forbearing, by all these other ways, and also forgiving. But in practice, that gap can be so large that practically speaking, many people can't get over that gap. And when a person is not um, sorry, and in fact may even blame you, then uh, you know, that makes the wall, that makes that injustice gap even larger and even harder to forgive. Now we can forgive that. That forgiveness happens inside my skin, and so I can forgive that. But there's a social interaction that I continue to have with this person, and so I am going to need to talk with this person more about what they've done, what I think they've done, what they think they've done, and try to come to some kind of social meeting, if we can, about how we're going to keep our relationship going or not.
So you can forgive, but you would still address the thing that's causing the friction or the problem. Is that correct?
That's right.
Okay, because that answers the other question that was posed here. How do I forgive someone who keeps on doing the same thing to me over and over again?
Right. And that requires forgiving over and over again. But socially, about the second or third time, if I haven't already, I need to address this and say, you cannot keep hurting me one way or the other. We're going to have to either put some guidelines in effect that are going to govern our relationship, or we're going to have to split our relationship and not continue this relationship. So socially, I can make kind of rules. I don't like to call them rules, but guidelines.
Boundaries.
But I can still forgive every single time. Turns out I can make a decision to forgive and treat this person as a valuable human. My emotional forgiveness may not go to zero. It may never go to zero again if they're going to keep hurting me again and again and again.
Sure. Okay, then another question we have is, what is rumination and what does it look like in my life?
Yeah, I like to think of rumination as like watching reruns on television of very bad B movies. It's when I get to thinking about something that was done to me, and I keep perseverating again and again on how much I've been hurt, how much I've been injured. I'm never going to get over this, and sometimes both. What a jerk this person is. This person is brain dead. They were dropped on their head as a child. All of these negative thoughts about the person and the event. That's rumination.
So it's really playing a recording in your head, the same recording over and over, and then the emotions of either, as you said, anger or, wishing them terrible things like that.
Right. And rumination, if you think about a ruminant is a cow or an animal that chews cud and then swallows it and spits it up again and chews it again and again. So you can see where that came from.
Okay.
It ain't pretty. It's not pretty.
No, it's definitely helpful. I see there's a question that actually links to something that someone that previously asked. Although much as forgiveness is beneficial, it may also be emotionally draining to forgive repetitive behavior. Is there a way to mitigate this? And I think you've discussed it. You've said the way to do it is one would forgive over and over, but you would have a discussion on boundaries or rules of engagement, and then either that could improve, or you might just say, okay, we need to part ways, but you're still forgiving the person.
That's right. Yeah. So that injustice gap is crucial, and the idea that there are many ways to lower that gap. It doesn't have to be all forgiveness. It's not all or nothing. I can mix a little bit of justice with forgiveness, justice, forbearance, forgiveness, acceptance. All of those things can be mixed.
Okay. Someone's asked, who is responsible for the altruistic gift? The offender or the victim? And if the victim, how does it help the offender?
So it is, so giving an altruistic gift is of forgiveness, is the victim is forgiving. And how does it help the victim? Well, it can start to repair the relationship. But also, there has been a lot of research this last couple of years on how if we receive forgiveness, that is, if I forgive altruistically in my heart, but then I say to you, I forgive, and so that you can receive this, that helps people take responsibility even beyond the responsibility they might have taken before. It helps them forgive themselves, and it even can, turn them to God and help them deal with this on a spiritual level. So there are several different ways that forgiving someone can help them. But that's different from just letting the person off of the hook. So I don't want to have it confused with just saying it's okay, it's okay.
Yes.
It may not be okay. I may have to address the accountability and responsibility they had in hurting me, but that's just part of the social part.
Yes. And that, same as what you said earlier, you're forgiving the person, but the course of justice would still need to go if it's in the case of a criminal act or something like that.
That's right.
I've got another question here. Someone once said, unforgiveness is like drinking poison and expecting the next person or the other person to die, yet it kills you. How true is this statement?
It is, as you will see tomorrow, if you come and see Lauren Toussaint talk about physical health, you're going to see that there is a lot of scientific evidence supporting not quite that extreme a statement, but the idea that if I hold on to unforgiveness and I keep getting my cortisol level high, cortisol maintained at a high level will shrink your brain. It will shrink the hippocampus in particular, sometimes as much as 20 to 25% the size. It will put you at more risk for all kinds of cardiovascular problems, such as stroke, high blood pressure, hypertension. It will affect the immune system. You can't fight off diseases as well. It will give GI problems, colitis and things that happen in the gastrointestinal tract. It can affect the sexual and reproductive cycle. So basically, if you get a chance to get your cortisol elevated at a high level and keep it there, say no to that. And the one easy way to say no to that is to forgive.
So there's the answer then. There are so many benefits to forgiveness. And I think for too long, it's been linked only to the spiritual or the divine aspect and not as much to the psychological or social aspect.
Right.
Someone's asked a question, and that's actually a very good question in this sense. How do you tell a person you've forgiven them when they don't recognize their actions as needing of forgiveness? Is it wise to tell them, like, would it be good, Everett, I forgave you, and meanwhile, you don't even know you did something wrong against me?
Yeah, clinically, I usually do not recommend that people do that because when I say to you, I forgive you, I am saying in parentheses, you did something wrong and bad, and you need forgiveness. And I, being magnanimous and a wonderful person, am willing to step down and forgive you. You see, if the person doesn't think that they've done anything wrong, that message is not going to help your relationship. So people often say, well, I feel better if I say that I forgive them. Well, great, but you won't feel better for long when they fight you back and say, I didn't do anything wrong, blah, blah, blah. So we don't recommend doing, kind of a unilaterally telling people that you forgive them, unless you were having a conversation, they ask for that.
Yes, yes. So maybe in that case, if you feel the need to speak it out, I guess going to a priest in confessional could also assist, or going to a friend, a trusted mentor that can hold confidence. Someone else has asked, the South African dilemma is that we've had transitional justice, but we have not had restorative justice. And they attribute the continued violence in South Africa to this fact, or this reason. What advice do you have for us as South Africans in moving forward?
Well, in a lot of ways, for a particular type of situation that apartheid was, South Africa is kind of a model for a lot of the people in the world, but a lot of societies do not fit into that. But what it really boils down to is anytime you make a statement about how socially these wrongs might be taken care of, you are going to get a normal curve, a bell curve of people who on the extremist ends, both of them will be violently opposed to what you have said. So no matter where you position yourself, you are going to get enemies on both sides, and you're going to get critics on both sides. And those critics can be more or less disruptive. And so, social ills just take a long time to heal. They take effort at engaging people on each end of the spectrum in conversations by the people that are near them, So this radical person way over here doesn't have much that will be heard by this radical person here. The people who are going to make a difference is going to be people who are a little more central, but close enough that they can have a conversation together. So I think, socially, it's those conversations that change people on the extremes. And I think the personal characteristic that promotes that the most is humility. So I think humility is like the prime virtue, that we need today. And that humility is one that sees one's own strengths or weaknesses accurately. It's something that makes me teachable. It's a modest self-portrayal, and it's being other-oriented to lift others up and not put them down. And that willingness to engage in a conversation with somebody who's different from you, but not that different, and lift them up and not put them down, I think that helps people move their position. It's eventually going to work toward healing society.
Oh, that's great. That's great. It lines up with someone who posted a quote here by George Herbert, who said, "He who cannot forgive others breaks the bridge over which he must pass himself."
Yeah, that was a great quote. I saw it pop up on the screen here.
Okay.
Yeah, I appreciated that.
Someone has asked, what advice would you give someone who's struggling to forgive themselves for the many mistakes they've done?
Well, I think that, feeling self-condemnation because I've made many mistakes, I think it's important that we do the things that I mentioned in those 6 steps, that we go to God with it and take care of the sacred elements. We try to make as many amends as we can socially, and maybe it's going to be counseling with friends, or counseling with a psychotherapist to try to deal with it psychologically. And at that point, then they can, work to apply that reach forgiveness model to themselves. And we've had a lot of success with that on quite a number of people in a number of studies. Um, the other problem, the other problem that comes after that, though, is self-acceptance. So people can maybe even get to the place where they say, well, I forgive myself. I can't accept myself as a person who would do this thing that I'm down on myself for. That's often harder than self-forgiveness. That does, I sometimes kind of lightheartedly, but it's not a laughing matter, say that's what keeps psychotherapists in business, is helping people deal with self-acceptance. So that's a hard struggle right there. So I think all of those are necessary. It's realizing that I am not going to be able to forgive myself just like that and let myself off the hook. That just doesn't work well. It's going to take time. It's going to take blood, sweat, and tears, basically. And I'm going to have to struggle with it.
Well, you spoke about it's going to take time, and someone's asked, what role does timing play in forgiveness?
Timing plays a crucial role, because if a person is not ready to deal with with working to forgive, they're going to resist it. So if somebody comes up and says, you've got to forgive, and shakes their finger in the person's fist, they may feel like, well, yes, I'm religious, I know I've got to forgive, but dadgummit, I'm not going to. And they're going to dig their heels in. So there has to be a softening, a readiness in which the person is at least willing to investigate the things that might happen if I forgive, might not happen, or might happen if I don't forgive. The same thing is true on the offender's side. The offender has done wrong, and they may feel guilty and ashamed and very self-condemning, and they go, I'm sorry, I am so sorry. And they're like, so tell me I'm forgiven so I can feel better. Well, if this is the first that I've heard that they're sorry, I'm not going to be willing to forgive right off. So they have to be willing to be patient, to let the person process that they're sorry, and deal with the social aspects of it, and get to the place where they're willing to forgive. So you see, on both sides, timing is really a crucial thing.
Yes. We still have another question, but what I'd like to ask is, or make a comment. I recall reading a study of incarcerated folk who, in the area of self-forgiveness, were less likely to be reincarcerated after being let out of jail than those who didn't. Now, self-forgiveness in that case doesn't mean a murderer says, I forgive myself for committing murder, but I think in that case it is, I understand I committed a murder, but I'm still a valuable human being. I still have value as that, and I'm not going to be defined by that. But I found it very interesting that they are less likely to be reincarcerated, go back to prison, than those who have not forgiven themselves. Have you heard of that?
I can see how that would be a reasonable, conclusion. If a person is really sincere at forgiving themselves and they've worked through, I've taken responsibility for this, I've gone to God and dealt with this, I've tried to make amends as much as I can possibly make amends, I've done the psychological work, and now I forgive myself. That person is not just self-forgiving, they have really taken a stance of responsibility and accountability in the community. And if they do connect with people in the community because of that, then that's going to provide the social support that is so vital to keeping people from recidivism. So it makes sense that that could be a finding. And if you've seen a study like that, I don't disbelieve that study. I would say, yeah, that's reasonable.
Okay. I'd like to conclude with this final question and then just ask if our participants wouldn't mind staying on. I've just got an announcement to make at the end. One of the questions here, how and where and how do you draw the line between good self-criticism, which leads to excellence, and bad self-criticism, such as unforgiving to yourself, self-sabotage?
I do good self-criticism. No. That's a very poor attempt at humor, but I think it's important to be self-aware. I talked about humility and what a kind of, all kinds of people think that is like a prime virtue. And the very first condition of that is that I am accepting of my strengths and weaknesses, and I'm teachable. Well, both of those first two are all about being aware enough to criticize myself and then be able to take the positive steps I need to take in order to correct some of the weaknesses that I have and correct some of the faults that I have. So I think that humility, if we're striving toward that, will help us stay more grounded in terms of good self-criticism. Bad self-criticism is probably criticism where I criticize who I am. Well, I can't do much about who I am, but I can do a lot about what I've done and what I'm doing. So if I just say, I'm a jerk, I'm a complete jerk, I'm worthless, well, that's self-criticism that has no place to go. And so that would be bad self-criticism, I think, because it doesn't leave the person with the ability to do anything constructive.
Thank you for that. I'd like to conclude and say thank you so much for everything in your preparation for this, sharing your life story. I've heard it before and it inspired me and it's changed my life, my family's life. That, as I've said before, you walk the walk. You don't just talk the talk, you do both. You talk and walk. And someone, Gregory, said it very well. He said, glad I had the privilege of joining this webinar on forgiveness. I have a far greater appreciation to be forgiven by God through Jesus Christ and realize the need to forgive others for my own spiritual, emotional, and physical well-being. And I think that sums it up very well. Thank you, Gregory.